I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and all Indigenous people throughout our region, and particularly the land that I work on, the Yarraga and Turrbal people. Also, I always like to acknowledge the land I was born on, which is Kaurna land in Adelaide, because those particular elders and people who mentored me early have shaped a lot of the way I think about this work. So that's really important acknowledgement for me. We've had an exciting nearly 2 years. Our first role was to really scope and do some reviews of the current landscape, particularly in relation to innovation and working with men and bystanders. And that's expanded to boys as well. And we particularly looked at going outside the square of what constitutes innovation across the region. So we've done 2 reviews, and this has culminated in 2 roundtables, one in Melbourne last year and one earlier this year in late August in Bangkok in partnership with UNFPA, where we had around 20 people from around the region that work in this area of working with men and boys as an accountability measure. Key organisations working with victim survivors and key women's organisations. That was an amazing experience to see that diversity of views, but also where we really converged together in how we actually come with solutions. And it really highlighted some contrast between, say, Australia and New Zealand, where we've mostly focused on individual mechanisms to address violence that rely on categorisation, whereas more collectivist societies have really focused more on whole of community responses that are less reliant on therapeutic responses, but whole of community, the whole community coming together to prevent violence. So there's been a lot of information exchange of 2 quite distinct methodologies. We've also held another roundtable that relates to the intersections of men and trauma and violence and other mental health and alcohol and other drugs, prisons, incarceration, these sorts of factors that can influence pathways both towards violence and pathways away from violence. So we really want to stretch the boundaries of how we view different interventions. And also one of the key factors here is building relationships with different partners. We've really started off with using a whole lot of principles that are really learnt from Indigenous methods in terms of how to address things like racism. So accountability is critical to this work stream in addressing people who use violence and bystanders. And some of the key areas of accountability are that, for example, in situations of racism, it isn't the person, an Indigenous person or a person of colour's responsibility to intervene. It's actually a white fellow like me's responsibility. And the same applies for violence against women. It's up to men to intervene, boys to intervene, to stand up. And so that's been a guiding principle. It has been a real interdisciplinary effort, and also the different disciplines of stakeholders too comes into that. And we saw that really contribute to a rich roundtable, particularly just recently in Bangkok. Certainly one key theme that came from the roundtable that I think has been really influenced by an Indigenous approach, and that is the broader idea of accountability. Also using really the whole technique of roundtables brings in discussion, yarns, Indigenous methodologies about lived experience that have been critical to how we've shaped some of our activities over the last 2 years. And that's brought in lots of different disciplines, both legal, social work, which is my background, criminology, and sort of political science and sociology. And that's had links to international relations and across different work streams. We've been very fortunate of having a range of partners here in Australia, which include DV Connect here in Queensland, No to Violence in Melbourne, and they have some national coverage, as well as a number of other smaller agencies, as well as government. More recently, I've had a number of meetings with Department of Social Services and the new Minister, Jed Carney, discussing their priorities around really wanting to engage men and boys and take them on the journey. I guess one of the really interesting things about interdisciplinary collaboration here is we've challenged some of our concept about the binary between intervention and prevention. And that would not have been possible without having a range of disciplines actually come to this sort of point where we go, can you do both at the same time? And that has also been critical in both Indigenous knowledge about collectivist ideas, that when we think about violence against women, we know that we're probably only touching the tip of the iceberg in terms of reporting rates. And therefore we know we're not reaching in intervention services in Australia most men that may use violence or may be on a pathway towards using violence. And therefore you have to, our system relies on being categorised, either as a perpetrator or a victim, yet most people aren't. So we need to reach those populations, and I think we, through both discipline and looking at broader whole of community approaches across the Indo-Pacific, it's really changed our idea that you can do both at the same time. We are talking to people that are not using violence, we are talking to people that are currently using violence, and we are also talking to people that may have had some worrying ideas or some pathways or microaggressions that may put them at risk of a pathway towards violence. So we really want to change those different directions and think more broadly about how we reach people we're not currently reaching. I'm really excited by a range of things at the moment. The first one is we've been in discussions with UNICEF and a number of other stakeholders who attended our roundtable in Bangkok earlier this year. And this is looking at the co-design of programming for boys and young men in the Pacific. This will be an online program designed to reach boys in youth groups, schools, churches, to stimulate sort of conversations, not only about violence but also about well-being. So looking at soft entry points to begin conversations. And one of the really amazing things about this is being both designed by young men and boys in the region, but also we're looking to engage young men and boys as co-researchers. Girls, siblings, brothers could be real allies in supporting justice choices and advocating for young women's choices around their future. And this requires us to really think about constructions of masculinity, being culturally safe about how we address cultural myths, but honour particular cultural practices that really honour and respect choice and the position of women and children in culture. So we're really wanting to have these rich conversations with men and boys to look at how there can be alliances that support the safety of women and children in these really challenging areas that can often spark a lot of emotion, often are based on really complex hierarchies within cultures, established structures. And you've kind of got to change from within to really cause the lasting change. And that's really about how we engage men and boys to be allies in challenging those dominant practices that are really harmful. The really exciting bit is we're not just engaging in our own backyard, we're actually engaging in the Indo-Pacific, and that has really shaped some of the perspectives that we're using in Australia about this idea of how do we respond to simultaneous prevention and intervention. So that's what I think the real impact of CEVAW is the bigger picture of how things intersect. We have two things that are really important, is that I think because we've been influenced by an idea that gender-based violence is preventable. And that's because it's not determined by your gender or your sex. It's actually determined by a whole lot of other social factors that we can influence. And that gives me hope. And the reason that gives me hope is I have two sons. And being a man myself, you know, you want to see hope. But hope's not enough, because hope can be sort of, you can trade hope and not really do the commitment thing. So it's about commitment as well. So, you know, something that I think is part of this issue of addressing gender-based violence is also what motivates me is accountability and safety amongst men. I don't think we can fix the issue of gender-based violence when we have men not only using violence against women and children, but using violence against other men. You can't have one without the other. You've got to fix the whole issue of male violence. So we're really wanting to unpack this about, are there other areas we're really missing in the intervention system that can prevent violence and change the pathway for men and boys? We're not here for 5 minutes, we're here for a lot longer, and we're actually going to see things through.